yourself drift as we follow Kael, a young warrior on a journey into the heart of an ancient forest. Breathe deeply, let go, and let the story carry you gently to sleep. The village of Sable Hollow was a place that time forgot. Tucked away at the edge of a vast and ancient forest, its people lived quiet lives, their days marked by the rhythmic hum of nature. They spoke in hushed tones about the creatures that once roamed the forest. Giants, beasts of the night, and above all, dragons. These legends were passed down from one generation to the next, though few believed in them anymore. Few, except the elders, who still warned of the dangers that lurked beyond the trees. Kael was a young warrior, proud and eager to prove himself. He was sent on a seemingly simple task: venture deep into the forest and retrieve a rare herb that could heal the village's ailing elder. It was an honor, or so he thought, until he found himself alone beneath the twisted branches, with shadows that seemed to move even when the wind was still. The forest had an ancient weight, a presence that settled over him like a thick fog. As he ventured deeper, the light grew dim, though the sun still hung in the sky. It was as if the forest itself consumed the daylight. His footsteps fell softly on the moss-covered ground, and all around him, the air was thick with the scent of damp earth and decay. The deeper he went, the more the world seemed to fade, the trees closing in around him like silent sentinels, guarding some long-lost secret. Then he stumbled upon it. The clearing was small, almost hidden beneath a canopy of dark, gnarled branches. In its center lay the remnants of something immense, something ancient. Charred bones lay scattered across the ground, twisted and blackened, as though some great fire had consumed them long ago. The air was different here, charged, electric. At the heart of the clearing, a single drop of crimson liquid rested upon a smooth stone, glowing faintly in the dim light. Kael approached, his breath shallow. The drop of blood shimmered like molten ruby, pulsating with an almost hypnotic rhythm. It was no ordinary blood. He could feel its power from where he stood, like a whisper on the wind, beckoning him closer. The stories of dragons, once dismissed as mere fables, suddenly felt all too real. He hesitated, glancing around as if the trees themselves were watching him, waiting to see what he would do. But curiosity, or perhaps something more, drove him forward. Without thinking, he reached out, his fingers trembling as they brushed against the drop. The instant he touched it, the blood came alive, flowing up his hand and sinking into his skin. A sharp pain shot through him, like fire coursing through his veins. He staggered back, clutching his arm, but the sensation spread rapidly, consuming him. His vision blurred, and for a moment, the world around him twisted into something unfamiliar. He saw visions, flashes of great wings beating against the sky, of flames scorching the earth, and of shake the feeling that whatever he had awoken with that drop of blood was now stirring, and it would not rest again until it found him. The night had fallen thick and heavy by the time Kael reached the village, the familiar sight of Sable Hollow cloaked in a deep silence. Yet even in the stillness, something felt different. The forest had released him, but its grip lingered in his bones, as if he had left a piece of himself behind in the shadows. As he crossed the threshold of the village, his legs still felt strong, perhaps too strong, each step more assured, each breath more alive. He ignored it at first, chalking it up to adrenaline, the after effect of whatever strange magic had occurred in the heart of the forest. But deep down, Kael knew something had changed. The drop of blood had done more than just sear his skin. It had entered his very being. The elder was waiting for him in the longhouse, the dim glow of lanterns casting flickering shadows across the room. Her frail hands accepted the herb with a nod, her wise eyes lingering on Kael for a moment longer than he was comfortable with. She said nothing of the forest, but he could feel her gaze prying beneath the surface of his calm exterior. It was as if she could sense the shift in him, the hum of something unspoken beneath his skin. That night, Kael slept fitfully, his dreams a whirlwind of colors and sensations he couldn't understand. He stood on a battlefield, surrounded by towering creatures with scales as black as night, their wings casting shadows over the land. He felt the earth tremble beneath their weight, the heat of their breath scorching the air. And always, at the center of the storm, was the crimson glow of the blood, pulsing, alive, drawing him toward it like a beacon. He woke drenched in sweat, the taste of ash in his mouth. The darkness of his small hut seemed to press in on him, but his senses were sharper now, too sharp. He could hear the faint rustle of leaves outside, the distant murmur of the village night watch, even the soft creak of the wood beams overhead. The world had become too loud, too bright, too much. He threw off the covers and stepped outside into the cool night air, his heart still pounding with the echoes of the dream. The village was silent, but the forest loomed beyond, a living thing, watching him. He could feel it, like a presence just beyond the edge of his mind, something ancient, waiting, as if the earth itself was holding its breath. Kael clenched his fists, trying to shake the strange sensations, but even that felt different. His grip was stronger now, his muscles taut with a power he hadn't earned. He was no stranger to strength. Years of training had honed his body into a weapon. But this was something else. This was not the result of hard work or discipline. It was something wild, raw, untamed. Suddenly, a movement caught his eye. A flicker of shadow at the edge of the village, near the tree line. Kael's body emerging from the darkness, low to the ground, gleaming with an unnatural light. He blinked, and they were gone. The night swallowed the figure as quickly as it had appeared, but the sense of being watched did not fade. Kael stood there for a long time, staring into the forest, his pulse quickening. The visions from his dream lingered in his mind. The dragons, the blood, the immense power. And with them came a new terrifying thought. What if the blood had awakened something? The next morning, Kael went about his duties as usual, though the gnawing feeling never left him. His newfound strength was impossible to ignore. Tasks that had once taken effort now seemed trivial. Lifting, carrying, even his grip on his sword felt different. But it wasn't just his body. His mind too had shifted. His thoughts were quicker, sharper, and more restless. He caught glimpses of things he shouldn't have been able to see, heard whispers of conversations far off in the distance. Yet, with every new sensation came a weight, an unspoken dread that hung over him. Kael realized he wasn't merely stronger. He was connected to something vast, something that stirred in the ancient corners of the earth. It was as though the blood had opened a door, and something on the other side was beginning to stir. The forest, once a place of fear and mystery, now felt like a living entity, its eyes constantly upon him. And somewhere deep within its shadows, he could feel the presence of something immense, a creature of scales and flame, ancient and relentless, drawn to the blood that now pulsed through his veins. Kael had become a part of their world, and they were coming for him. The days that followed were strange and quiet, as if the world itself held its breath in anticipation. Kael moved through the village as he always had, but now everything seemed sharper, more defined, as if a veil had been lifted from his eyes. He saw things no one else noticed. The subtle shift of wind through the trees, the flicker of a shadow where none should be, the faint rustle of leaves when the air was still. He could feel the forest pressing in, its ancient weight bearing down on him. The villagers went about their lives, unaware of the unease settling over their protector. They still smiled, still spoke of mundane things, still worked the fields and tended their homes. But Kael could no longer focus on their words. His mind was elsewhere, drawn to the dark borders of the forest, where something waited. He could sense it now, watching him with eyes as old as the earth itself. One evening, as dusk crept in and the sun dipped below the horizon, Kael felt it again, a presence, closer this time. He stood at the edge of the village, his gaze fixed on the darkening woods, his hands clenched into fists, his heart pounding with an unnatural rhythm that matched the pulse of the blood in his veins. Somewhere beyond the tree line, something was moving. For hours, Kael remained there, his eyes unblinking, scanning the shadows. The night had a different texture now, deeper, muscles tensed, every instinct screaming for him to run, but he held his ground. The shape reappeared, closer this time. A low growl echoed through the night, barely audible, yet it reverberated in Kael's chest like the rumble of distant thunder. He reached for his sword, the cold steel a comfort in his hand, though he wasn't sure it would be enough against whatever lurked in the dark. Then the creature emerged. It was massive, larger than any beast he had ever seen, its form a shadow against the faint moonlight. Black scales glistened in the darkness, and its eyes were the color of molten gold, glowing with an eerie light that pierced the night. For a moment, Kael's breath caught in his throat. He knew this creature. He had seen it before, in his visions, in the flashes of memory that haunted his dreams. It was a dragon. The beast circled the edge of the clearing, watching him with those ancient eyes. There was intelligence in its gaze, something more than animal cunning, something ancient, something dangerous. Kael could feel the weight of its presence pressing down on him, as if the air itself had grown heavier. The blood in his veins pulsed harder, hotter, and with it came a strange sensation, a connection, a bond. The dragon stepped forward, its claws digging into the earth with a slow, deliberate grace. It lowered its head, and for a moment, Kael thought it might attack, but instead, it simply watched him, its eyes narrowing as if assessing him, judging him. The world around them seemed to fall away, leaving only the two of them, warrior and dragon, locked in a silent, tense standoff. And then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the dragon turned and vanished into the woods, its massive form melting into the shadows with a speed and grace that defied its size. The forest swallowed it whole, leaving Kael alone, his heart racing and his mind spinning. He stood there for a long time, staring into the darkness where the dragon had disappeared. His grip on his sword tightened, though he knew now that steel would not be enough. The dragons were not just beasts, they were something far older, far more powerful, and they were drawn to him, called by the blood that now coursed through his body. That night, Kael couldn't sleep. He could still feel the dragon's eyes on him, even though it was long gone. The presence that had haunted the edge of the village was no longer just a shadow or a flicker of movement. It was real, tangible, and it was coming closer. He was not merely a man anymore. He was something more, something marked. The villagers remained oblivious to the danger that lurked just beyond the trees, but Kael knew the truth. The dragons were coming, and with each passing day, they drew nearer. He could feel them in his blood, in his bones, in the very air around him. They were watching, waiting, and they would not stop until they had what they sought. The nights were no longer peaceful. Kael could feel the weight of the approaching storm, an invisible force pressing against the air, as if the world itself was bracing for was to come. The village remained oblivious, but Kael sensed it in his every step, in every breath he took. The presence of something immense and relentless, circling him from afar, tightening its hold with each passing day. The dragon he had seen that night never returned, but its absence only made the silence more unbearable. The knowledge that it was out there, watching, waiting, gnawed at him, stealing sleep from his nights and peace from his days. Every shadow seemed to hide something more, and the forest loomed larger with every glance he cast toward it. One evening, the stillness finally broke. Kael had ventured into the woods at dusk, as he had done every night since the first encounter, hoping to gain some insight into the growing darkness that stalked him. His instincts, now sharper and more attuned to the forest, had begun guiding him to strange places, clearings that felt too quiet, trees that bore the unmistakable marks of claws too large for any creature of the forest. But that night was different. The air was thick, heavy with a presence that Kael had not felt since the night of the blood. The sun was sinking below the horizon, casting the forest in a deep amber glow. The trees whispered in the wind, their branches swaying like fingers pointing to something unseen. As Kael walked deeper into the woods, a low growl reverberated through the ground, stopping him in his tracks. It was not the growl of a wolf or any beast of the wild. This was something far more ancient, more primal. He unsheathed his sword, the steel gleaming faintly in the dying light. His grip tightened as he scanned the trees, searching for any sign of movement. But the forest had gone utterly still. Even the birds, which had filled the air with their songs only moments before, had fallen silent. Then, with a sudden rush of wind, it emerged from the shadows. The dragon was larger than Kael had imagined, its sleek black scales blending seamlessly with the darkening forest. Its wings unfurled like great sails, casting long shadows across the ground, and its eyes, those molten gold eyes, fixed on him with an intensity that sent a chill down his spine. The air around it seemed to ripple with heat, distorting the space between them, as if the creature carried with it the remnants of some faraway inferno. Kael took a step back, his pulse quickening. He had seen this dragon before, in his dreams, in the flashes of memory that now haunted his every waking moment. But seeing it in the flesh was something else entirely. The power radiating from the creature was palpable, a force that pressed against his chest, making it hard to breathe. The dragon's gaze never wavered. It lowered its head slightly, nostrils flaring as it inhaled deeply, as if it could smell the blood in Kael's veins. The blood that had drawn it here. The blood that now marked him as one of their own. Kael's heart raced, and yet, some part of him, the part that had been touched by the dragon's blood, remained eerily calm. He felt an undeniable connection to the beast before him, growing as it stepped closer. Kael's muscles tensed, ready for the fight. But in that moment, he knew. This was not a battle he could win with steel alone. The dragon had come not for a fight, but for the blood. The realization struck him with a cold clarity. It wasn't just the strength that attracted them. It was the essence of the blood itself, the power it held, the ancient bond it represented. With a sudden roar, the dragon lunged. Kael moved on instinct, his body reacting faster than his mind. He rolled to the side, narrowly avoiding the massive claws that tore into the earth where he had stood. The ground shook beneath him as the dragon's wings beat the air, sending debris flying. Kael's pulse thundered in his ears, but the blood, his blood, rushed with a strange, exhilarating power. He struck out with his sword, but the blade glanced off the dragon's scales with a hollow ring. The creature barely flinched, its eyes gleaming with something close to amusement. Kael knew he couldn't defeat it. Not like this. Desperation clawed at him, but then, just as quickly as it had attacked, the dragon paused. It stood still, watching him with those ancient eyes, as if weighing something deep within. And then, in a blur of motion, it withdrew, disappearing into the shadows as quickly as it had come. Kael was left alone, panting in the darkening forest, his heart pounding in his chest. He hadn't defeated the dragon. It had chosen to leave. And that terrified him more than any battle ever could. The blood had called it, and it would call again. Next time, it might not leave. Kael wandered through the village streets, the weight of his encounter with the dragon pressing on him like an invisible shroud. The faces of the villagers seemed distant, their lives untouched by the growing darkness that hovered just beyond the forest. They laughed, worked, and lived as if nothing had changed. But for Kael, the world had shifted irrevocably. He could no longer ignore the pull of the blood, the call that echoed in the back of his mind like a faint whisper that refused to be silenced. That night, the dreams came again. Visions of ancient beasts, their wings casting shadows over mountains, their roars shaking the earth. In these dreams, Kael was no longer just a man. He was something more, something tied to the dragons in a way that he couldn't understand. When he woke, his body hummed with the residual power of the blood, a force that seemed to grow stronger with every passing day. But he could not face the dragons alone, not without understanding what the blood had done to him, not without knowing what they wanted. It was then that Kael remembered the old tales, whispered by the firelight when he was just a child. Stories of an ancient scholar, a recluse who lived beyond The scholar's domain was long and treacherous, the path winding through jagged cliffs and deep ravines. The air grew colder as Kael ascended the mountains, the wind carrying with it the faint echo of distant cries, almost like the whisper of dragons' wings far above. He traveled alone, his mind heavy with questions, his body aching from the strain of the climb. But the blood urged him forward, pulling him toward the answers he sought. At last, after days of travel, Kael arrived at the scholar's hidden dwelling, a small, unassuming hut built into the side of the mountain. Smoke curled lazily from a chimney, and the scent of burning herbs filled the air. There was something timeless about the place, as if it existed outside the boundaries of the world Kael knew. The scholar appeared at the door before Kael could knock. He was old, far older than Kael had imagined. His skin was weathered, his eyes deep set and sharp, like those of a man who had seen the rise and fall of countless ages. He said nothing at first, only watched Kael with a knowing gaze, as if he could see the blood that coursed through Kael's veins, as if he had been expecting him. "You carry the burden," the scholar finally said, his voice a low rasp that seemed to blend with the wind. "The blood of dragons." Kael stiffened at the words, though he had known this truth in his heart. Still, hearing it spoken aloud sent a shiver through him. "I need to know what's happening to me," Kael said, his voice tense with urgency. "The blood, it gives me strength, but it also calls to them. The dragons. Why?" The scholar gestured for Kael to follow him inside. The hut was filled with books and scrolls, ancient relics that spoke of a time long forgotten. The air was thick with the scent of parchment and incense, creating a strange sense of both comfort and foreboding. The scholar moved slowly, his steps measured, as if weighed down by the centuries of knowledge he carried. "The blood you carry," the scholar began, his voice barely more than a whisper, "is not merely the blood of beasts. It is the essence of an ancient pact, forged long before man walked the earth. The dragons, creatures of flame and fury, once ruled this world. Their blood holds power, but it also binds them to one another. To take their blood into yourself is to take a part of their legacy, and they will come for it." Kael's breath caught in his throat. But why? Why do they want it back? The scholar turned to face him, his eyes gleaming with the weight of his words. "The blood is not just strength, it is life. It is memory, and in you it stirs. The dragons can sense it, feel its pulse as if it were their own. They are not just coming for the blood, they are coming for the connection it creates, the bond between you and them. flickering firelight, the scholar's words echoing in his mind like a haunting refrain. The warmth of the fire did little to thaw the cold that had settled deep within him, a chill born not of the mountain air, but of the dark truth he could no longer deny. The blood had changed him, and with each passing moment, the change grew stronger, more insidious. The scholar had fallen silent, allowing the weight of his revelation to sink into the quiet of the night. His wrinkled hands worked methodically as he brewed a dark tea, the scent of unfamiliar herbs filling the small hut. Kael's mind swirled with questions, but none found voice. There was no escaping the truth that clung to him now. The blood was not just a gift, it was a curse. The dragons, Kael began slowly, trying to gather the fraying edges of his thoughts. They can feel me, can't they? Every time I face them, it's as if they know what I am, what I'm becoming. The scholar nodded, his eyes gleaming with a quiet wisdom. Yes, they are drawn to the blood, to the power it holds. But more than that, they are drawn to you. The bond is not just one of strength, it is deeper, it is ancient. Kael shifted uneasily, the firelight casting long shadows on the walls of the hut. The scholar's words felt like a heavy chain tightening around his chest. What do they want from me? Why don't they just kill me and take back the blood? They are waiting, the scholar replied, his voice barely above a whisper. Waiting for you to choose. To choose? Kael's brow furrowed, confusion and frustration blending in his voice. Choose what? The scholar paused, his gaze lingering on the flames, as if they might offer him the words he sought. The blood is not simply a substance, it is a legacy, one passed down through time, from dragon to dragon. By touching it, by absorbing it, you became a part of that legacy. You carry their essence, their memories, their power. And with that power comes a choice, to resist it or to embrace it. Kael's heart raced. The very idea felt impossible, surreal. You're saying I could become like them? The scholar's eyes darkened. Not just like them. One of them. The silence that followed was suffocating. Kael felt as if the air had been stolen from his lungs, his body frozen as the scholar's words settled over him like a heavy fog. The thought was unthinkable, but deep within, Kael knew there was truth in it. He had felt it, the slow pull, the primal instincts awakening in the corners of his mind. The strange connection to the dragons that had grown stronger with each encounter. You felt it already, the scholar continued, his voice as soft as the wind outside. The visions, the strength, the sense of being watched. The blood is changing you. It is calling to the other dragons, yes, but it is also calling to something within you. Something old, something that waits to be awakened. Kael clenched his fists, the warmth of the fire doing little to calm the storm that now raged inside him. He could feel the blood humming beneath his skin, a influence began. Is there a way to stop it? Kael's voice was tight, desperate. Can I rid myself of this curse? The scholar sighed, his ancient face creasing with sorrow. There is no simple answer. The blood has bound itself to you, and to remove it would mean undoing that bond. Such a thing could kill you, or it could strip you of everything that makes you who you are. But even if you survive, there is no guarantee the dragons will stop hunting you. The blood's call cannot be silenced easily. Kael's heart sank. The weight of the scholar's words pressed down on him like a mountain, and he felt the edges of his world begin to crumble. There was no escaping this fate, no turning back from the path he had unknowingly set upon the moment he touched the dragon's blood. I cannot fight them forever, Kael murmured, his gaze falling to the floor. They grow stronger with each encounter, and I am losing myself to this power. The scholar leaned forward, his eyes piercing through the gloom. Then you must make your choice, Kael. Resist the blood and remain who you are, knowing that you may never fully escape its grasp. Or embrace it, become what the blood calls you to be, and take control of the power that now courses through you. Kael's hands trembled, the fire crackled, and in its flickering light, he saw his reflection in the scholar's dark eyes. A man on the brink of something far greater and far more dangerous than he had ever imagined. He could not escape the blood, but he still had a choice. The journey back to Sable Hollow felt longer than it had before, though Kael moved with the speed of a man pursued. The scholar's words clung to him like a mist, each step carrying the weight of a choice not yet made. His mind was a whirl of uncertainty, but his body felt more alive than ever, as if the very blood within him thrummed with power that grew stronger with each passing moment. The path wound through thick woods and across rocky outcroppings, the forest pressing in around him with an unnatural silence. Even the birds, which had once filled the trees with their songs, were absent. It was as though the entire world had drawn a collective breath, waiting, watching. Kael knew that time was running out. The blood called to the dragons, and they were coming. The first encounter had been a warning, a test, but he had felt it, an ancient force growing closer, each dragon sensing the blood in him like a beacon, each one more determined than the last. The hunt had begun, and Kael was the quarry. By the time he reached the village, dusk had fallen, casting long shadows across the ground. The air was thick with the promise of a storm, and the villagers moved quickly to secure their homes for the night. Kael slipped through the streets unnoticed, his cloak drawn tightly around him as if he could hide the change that had begun to take root within him. But no matter how he concealed himself, the blood burned in his veins. That night, the wind howled through the village like a chorus of restless spirits. was intoxicating, this power, an unstoppable force that surged through him like fire, begging to be unleashed. But with it came something darker. He could feel the pull of the dragons, their presence pressing in from the edges of his consciousness. They were no longer shadows in the distance. They were near, too near. A sudden crash shattered the silence of the night. Kael leapt to his feet, sword in hand, as the ground trembled beneath him. He burst from his hut to find the village in chaos, villagers running for cover, their shouts drowned out by the deafening roar that echoed across the valley. His heart raced, his pulse quickening in a way that felt more dragon than human. He could feel it, the blood responding to the call, urging him toward the fight, toward the beast that had come for him. And then he saw it, descending from the sky like a shadow torn from the night itself. The dragon was larger than the one before, its scales glistening like obsidian in the moonlight. Its wings beat the air with a force that sent gusts of wind through the village, toppling carts and scattering debris. Its eyes, glowing with a deep, smouldering light, locked onto Kael, and for a moment, everything else fell away. It had come for him. Kael's muscles tensed, every fiber of his being humming with energy. The blood burned hot in his veins, a fire that demanded release. But he fought against it, gripping his sword tighter as the dragon landed with a thundering crash. The earth trembled beneath its weight, and its massive claws dug into the soil as it lowered its head, its nostrils flaring as it caught his scent. A growl rumbled from deep within the creature's throat, vibrating through the air. Kael knew this was not a battle he could win with steel alone. The sword in his hand felt small, insignificant, against the sheer size and power of the beast before him. He could feel the blood pulsing with recognition, as if the dragon's presence ignited something deep within him, something primal and ancient. The dragon lunged. Kael moved with a speed that startled even him, his reflexes quicker, more fluid, as he dodged the dragon's massive claws. The air crackled with tension as he circled the beast, his every movement guided by the blood, his instincts sharper than they had ever been. But with every strike, every evasive move, he felt it, the temptation, the call of the power within him, urging him to embrace it fully. The dragon roared, its breath scorching the air as it unleashed a torrent of flame. Kael leapt out of the way, the heat singeing his skin, but the fire within him burned hotter. His grip on his sword faltered as the blood screamed for release, for the strength that would allow him to overpower the creature. For a moment, Kael hesitated. He could feel it, an body moving with an unnatural fluidity. He was no longer just Kael the warrior. He was something more, something else. The dragon charged, but Kael was ready. The night was alive with the scent of smoke and blood, the village still trembling from the dragon's attack. Kael stood among the ruins, his chest rising and falling with each labored breath, his body thrumming with the power he had unleashed. He could still feel the fire in his veins, the dragon's blood coursing through him with a wild intensity that had yet to subside. The dragon lay defeated, its massive form crumpled on the outskirts of the village, its golden eyes dimming as life drained from it. But victory brought no peace. Kael's hands shook, not from exhaustion, but from the fear of what he had become. In that moment, as the dragon lunged and his blade sliced through its scales, he had let the blood take control. It had felt like a floodgate opening, a surge of raw, primal power that had nearly consumed him. The line between himself and the beast he fought had blurred. He was no longer just Kael, the warrior. He had felt something deeper stir within him, something that wasn't entirely human. The villagers cowered in their homes, their fear palpable. They had seen what he had done, seen the way his body moved like a creature possessed. He could hear their whispers even now, the way they spoke of him not as a hero, but as a monster, something to be feared. Kael clenched his fists, the blood still burning beneath his skin. He had to know, had to understand what he was becoming before it was too late. The scholar's warning echoed in his mind, but the words that haunted him most were those he had not yet spoken. There is one more who holds the answer, the last dragon. The scholar had mentioned it in passing, a creature older than the mountains, older than the world itself, said to have witnessed the rise of the ancient pact between dragons and men. It was the only dragon that had not answered the call of the blood, the only one that had remained hidden, buried deep within the mountains, its lair untouched by time. Kael knew that if he was to find answers, he would find them there. But the journey would be perilous, and even the thought of facing such a creature filled him with a deep, unshakable dread. Yet, the pull of the blood would not let him rest. It thrummed beneath his skin, guiding him toward the mountains, toward the place where the final answers lay hidden. The path to the lair of the last dragon was not marked on any map. The scholar had told him of it only in hushed whispers, describing a place lost to time, where the air grew thick with magic, and the very rocks seemed to pulse with ancient power. It was a place where few dared to tread, and those who did never returned. Kael journeyed alone, the mountains rising before him like silent sentinels, their peaks shrouded in mist. The air grew colder the higher he climbed, the wind howling through the jagged cliffs as if warning him to turn back. But he pressed on, the fire in his blood urging him forward with an intensity that bordered on madness. He could feel the presence of the dragon growing stronger with each step, as if the very earth beneath him trembled with its breath. Days passed in a blur of cold and stone. Kael's mind wandered through the haze of memories and visions that had plagued him since the blood entered his veins. He saw flashes of dragons soaring through the skies, their wings blotting out the sun, their roars shaking the heavens. He felt their power, their hunger, their ancient wisdom coursing through him, mingling with his own thoughts until he could no longer tell where he ended and they began. At last, Kael reached the mouth of a great cavern, its entrance framed by towering stone pillars carved with symbols too old to decipher. The air was thick with the scent of earth and something far older, a power that hummed in the silence. This was the place, the lair of the last dragon. He stepped inside, the darkness swallowing him whole. The cave was vast, its walls disappearing into the shadows, and the air buzzed with an eerie stillness, as if the world itself held its breath. His footsteps echoed through the hollow chamber, and with each step, the blood pulsed stronger, guiding him deeper into the heart of the mountain. And then he saw it. The last dragon lay coiled at the center of the cavern, its massive body shimmering with an iridescent glow that seemed to pulse in time with the blood in Kael's veins. Its eyes, ancient and filled with the weight of eons, slowly opened, fixing on him with a gaze that pierced through the veil of time itself. For a moment, the world stood still. Kael felt the dragon's presence fill the cavern, a power so immense it made the air itself tremble. He could feel its mind brushing against his own, a consciousness so vast it was like staring into the abyss of the universe. And yet, there was something familiar in its gaze, something that echoed in the deepest parts of him. The dragon spoke, not with words, but with a voice that resonated in Kael's mind, a voice that carried the weight of millennia. You have come to understand. Kael's breath caught in his throat. The time for answers had come. The stillness in the lair was suffocating, the weight of the dragon's gaze pressing down on Kael like a mountain. Time seemed to stretch, its passage forgotten in the cavern's deep silence. Before him, the last dragon lay coiled in the heart of its ancient domain, its eyes gleaming with the light of forgotten eras. The dragon's presence was a force in itself, older than anything Kael had ever known, older than the very stones beneath his feet. You have come to understand. The voice of the dragon echoed again in Kael's mind. Not a question, but a truth. It resonated through him like a tolling bell, a sound that shook the core of his being. Kael could feel the blood inside him hum in response, as though it recognized its kin, as though the power that had stirred in him from the moment he touched the blood was finally answering its call. I've come for answers. Kael's voice sounded small in the vastness of the cavern, yet it carried the urgency of a man on the edge of something too great to comprehend. chosen by the dragons to carry their blood, to hold their legacy. But with that power came a choice, and the weight of that choice crushed many. The dragon's voice swelled. The blood binds us as it binds you. You have felt its call. The power within you grows with each passing day. But with that power comes the pull of something greater. To resist it is to remain as you are, mortal, fragile, destined to fade. To embrace it is to become like us. Kael's heart pounded in his chest. The words reverberated through him, each syllable sinking deeper, as if they were not spoken but rather born from some place within him. The blood in his veins thrummed, a fire that refused to be contained, and he knew that the dragon spoke the truth. He had felt it, the slow unraveling of his humanity, the growing strength that made him something more, but also something less. If I embrace it, Kael's voice was barely above a whisper, his throat tight. What will I become? The dragon's gaze bore into him, and for the first time, Kael felt a deep sorrow there, a sadness that seemed to stretch across the centuries. You will become what the blood desires. You will be one with the dragons, with our power, our memories, our legacy. You will never age, never weaken, but neither will you remain what you are. You will no longer be bound to the world of men. You will be bound to the skies, to the fire, to the blood. The words hung in the air, thick and heavy with meaning. Kael's breath quickened as he stared into the dragon's eyes, the weight of his decisions settling on his shoulders. He had sought answers, but the truth was more than he had expected, more than he had ever wanted. The choice was clear, but the consequences were vast, unknowable. I don't want to lose myself, Kael said, his voice raw, his thoughts tangled in the weight of what he was facing. I don't want to become something else, something not human. Humanity is but a fleeting thing. The dragon's voice was softer now, a low rumble that resonated in Kael's chest. It fades with time, but the blood is eternal. It offers you freedom beyond what you can imagine, but freedom always comes with a cost. Kael closed his eyes, the fire in his veins burning hotter, as if it were urging him forward, calling him to embrace the power that surged just beneath the surface. He could feel it, the strength, the speed, the connection to something ancient and unstoppable. But with it came a darkness, a pull towards something unknown, something that would change him forever. For a moment, the world seemed to pause, the weight of the choice crushing him. He could resist, remain as he was, Kael, the warrior, mortal and bound to the earth. Or he could surrender to the blood, to the power that called him, and become something far greater, far more dangerous. The dragon's eyes